Hello and welcome to the Africa Unplugged podcast. My name is Fiona Kemijisha and I'll be your host. Thank you for joining us on this particular episode where we're excited to have a really great guest joining us from the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption. Welcome, Ms. Nchimunya.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and welcome to the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption.
We appreciate you having us in your space and for also making the time to come and talk to our audience. I'm going to just give you a second to introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about what you do. The audience also really likes to get to know our guests, so perhaps you could tell us maybe 2 words as well that describe you.
Thank you so much. Like you've indicated, I'm Charity Nchimunya. I am the Executive Secretary of the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption. Or AUABC in short, and the AUABC is a treaty monitoring organ of the African Union, and we've been charged with the responsibility of advising member states in as far as the fight against corruption is concerned. So we normally follow up on the implementation of the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. And in my role as Executive Secretary here at the board, I've been working with the board to ensure that we have certain programs, interventions that are cascaded down to the member states in as far as fighting corruption is concerned. So I've been on the front line fighting corruption since 2002, when I first joined the Zambian Anti-Corruption Commission as a corruption prevention officer, rose through the ranks to the senior corruption prevention officer. And then in 2016, I found my way here at the Advisory Board Against Corruption as Executive Secretary. And I consider myself focused and forward-looking in matters of fighting corruption.
And can I just say, as a woman, it's really wonderful to see women taking up space in such an important space, a space that impacts and influences how we live and how we are governed. So let me take you right into our first question, which actually comes from the convention. Article 2 talks about harmonizing policies and legislation between state parties. And so we'd like to talk about, I think that brings me to something about implementation, domestication. How does the board actually go about the implementation of this convention? Perhaps you could give us an understanding of what that looks like.
Thank you so much for that question. Well, in terms of how the board goes about its work in ensuring that there's sufficient legislation, first and foremost, among the state parties, it does this through reviews, and what we normally do is when a country has ratified the convention, they become a state party to the convention, they are supposed to send the board a baseline report in which they highlight the various interventions, the various institutions that are available to fight corruption, as well as other interventions. So once we get that baseline report, we study it as a board, we tease out the issues that need further follow-ups, and then after that we actually undertake a country review mission. And when we undertake the country review mission, we get on the ground, we speak to different stakeholders to see how far the state party to the convention has actually implemented the various provisions of the convention. We want to verify on ground what is happening, what is in place, and we also talk to civil society organizations as a key stakeholder in the fight against corruption, because sometimes government institutions or state institutions may say one thing, but on ground it's different. So we want to sort of verify the information from the perspective of civil society organizations. So we take time to talk to them so that we get their perspective on how they feel their governments are implementing the various provisions of the convention. And once we've done that, we then do a report and we highlight issues where further action may be needed and make recommendations. That report then goes to the Executive Council, which is a policy organ of the African Union. It consists of the 55 Ministers of Foreign Affairs. And once the report has been adopted by them, then a state party is obliged to implement the various provisions or the various recommendations as contained in our report. So in a nutshell, we mainly follow up on the fight against corruption in member states through review missions based on their baseline report that they submit to the board.
Accountability, right from the base, actually, like you said, baseline from the base. All right, thank you for that. I think that there's a lot of, sometimes these conventions and bodies seem so mysterious, especially to young people. So it's great to really get an understanding of what happens in there. So just moving on to my next question, you were sharing also about, we're talking about how this works. And you talked about civil society. And so I also think about organizations such as Transparency International, where they use a measure of corruption perception index. And in most countries, there is an ombudsman, by whichever name they may go by, which use a measure of, say, government surveys of some kind. So what would you say is the best way of assessing the magnitude, the severity or the extent of corruption? Perhaps you can even share with us how the board assesses the progress. For example, are we moving forward? Are we moving back? How exactly is that measured?
Thank you so much. When it comes to issues of measuring either corruption or anti-corruption, it's a very challenging aspect, I must say. And actually, when you talk of the corruption perception index that TI does, member states have had concerns with it. Because sometimes they feel that it doesn't take into account the various interventions, the various activities or programs that are ongoing within a particular state party in as far as fighting corruption is concerned. So as a board, we've been actually tasked to sort of come up with a homegrown measure. And I'm just coming from Dar es Salaam. Actually, we had a meeting with key stakeholders from different national anti-corruption agencies. And we've brought on board a consultant who is helping to just come up with a homegrown African anti-corruption measurement. So the discussion actually revolved around, are we measuring corruption or are we measuring progress in anti-corruption efforts? So it's an ongoing venture. And we hope that by perhaps mid next year, 2023, we'll have something in place. But maybe getting back to your question, how we measure whether we are making progress and all, for us, from the perspective of the board, the key document remains the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. And it has various provisions on different aspects on the fight against corruption. For instance, state parties to the convention are expected to have in place dedicated national anti-corruption agencies that are fighting corruption. They are also supposed to put in place legislation that is meant to fight corruption. So for us, we begin from that as the base. And once a state party has given us a baseline report, we are supposed, after a few years, to go back and see how they are progressing in their fight against corruption. For instance, if a state party becomes, signs the convention, for instance, this year, 2022, it is expected that that state party should submit the baseline report by, if they signed in June 2022, for instance, by June 2023, they are supposed to give us a baseline report. And after that, then we go on ground to assess how far they've gone into the implementation. And once we've done our recommendations, again, after a few years, we are supposed to be able to go back and see how they've been able to progress. So that remains the key feature as of now in terms of how we assess whether a state party is making progress or not. But like I've indicated, we are also keen from the African perspective to come up with certain indicators, certain indices that will actually determine how much progress is being made. But like I've indicated, this is work in progress, and we are hoping to have something that is homegrown, that speaks to the specific context of the different African Union member states. So as and when that time happens, I think you'll be kept abreast, and I would want to chat with you further in terms of what is happening. But also in terms of the current, for instance, the CPI that TI does, a state party can choose to use the ratings to improve some of their maybe services, some of the issues that may not be going right. They can use that as a stepping stone to be where they want to be. So it's also a useful a useful measure, a useful tool that state parties can make use of.
All right. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's exciting. It's exciting to hear about homegrown solutions, homegrown solutions that are in development, things that can really capture our context, the context of Africa, the context of individual nations. So we'll definitely really be looking forward to hearing more about that and seeing how that pans out as well. So since the inception of the convention, the inception of the board itself, it's been quite a number of years. I know you told me you started in the early 2000s, and I imagine it started even before that. And from your personal view, what would you say, how would you rate, how things were and where we are heading? Would you say, I don't want to lock you down into a scale of 1 to 10 or anything like that, but what would you say is our progress really looking like?
Thank you so much for that question, and perhaps let me just give you some statistics in terms of maybe the convention, when it was adopted and all that, before I come to respond to your question. So the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption was adopted in 2003. To be specific, on 11th July 2003, and it came into force on 5th August 2006. That is after the 15th instrument of ratification was deposited. So it's been in force now. This is the 19th year. Next year we'll be celebrating 20 years since the adoption of the convention. And I think there's been some sort of progress that we can talk of. Back then in 2003, when the convention was being adopted, even talking about corruption was an issue. You couldn't talk about it the way we are speaking now. Now everyone is able to talk about it. Everyone, citizens of different state parties, they're able to ask certain questions. If their government is not living up to its promises, citizens are now more freer to talk about these issues. And I think for me, it's some sort of progress, because if you can talk about something on a table like this with your leaders, then you can be assured that something will be done about it. And so far now, from the 48 state parties that we have, we've been able to do, from 2017 alone, we've been able to undertake about 10 review missions. And as and when we do those review missions, there are certain positive indicators that are coming out of what state parties to the convention are doing. And there are also best practices in as far as fighting corruption is concerned. Some state parties, for instance, they've put in place mechanisms for asset declaration for public officials. One actually head of state not so long ago, I will not mention the country, was able to also declare his assets without being required by that particular country's laws to do so. But he wanted to set a tone that this is the way things ought to be done, because once you declare your assets, people are able to then monitor in terms of how you are progressing as someone who's been entrusted with public office. Are you amassing wealth at a rate that is faster than what you're earning, implying that perhaps you are dipping your hands in the coffers and hence stealing from the people? So once you do that, it's it's a good indication that you want to fight corruption, and you are bringing to the table your integrity, and others below you can then begin to look up, because I think it's all about leadership. If the leadership of a country say no to corruption and they walk the talk and take action when things are not right, then I think we can begin to say we are winning the fight against corruption on the African continent. So those are some of the positive indicators. Declaration of assets for leaders. Then most of the countries on the African continent, they've been able to put in place national anti-corruption agencies that are, some of them may not be as well resourced, but at least they are trying to be able to execute their mandate. There are laws, different laws that have been put in place to fight corruption. In some countries, they've even gone ahead to have lifestyle audits for public officials, because people want to know if, for instance, a person who was not able to afford certain things, now all of a sudden, because they are holding a government position, they are able to afford, for instance, holidays to the Seychelles. Someone should be able to ask, where is the money coming from? And as citizens, I think this is what we should be doing, to be able to hold our leaders accountable, accountable to how they deliver on their mandate. So those are some of the positives. And coming specifically to the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption, also we've been able to do certain things that we feel have had an impact in as far as fighting corruption is concerned. You may recall that in 2018, we were running with the African Union-wide theme, and it was on combating corruption as a sustainable pathway to Africa's development. And during that year, under the stewardship of His Excellency President Buhari of Nigeria as the champion, we were able to do a number of things. We even worked with the young people. There were 5 youth ambassadors on anti-corruption that were identified from the continent. And for us, even from the perspective of the entire African Union, we want to be able to capitalize on the strength and the numbers of young people, even in the fight against corruption. Because the more young people say no to corruption, then we can be assured that we'll have a critical mass that is fighting corruption. And also we've been hosting the African Anti-Corruption Dialogue since 2017, where we bring different actors, especially from national anti-corruption agencies, and each year we have a different theme, speaking to a pertinent aspect of the fight against corruption. And again, we have different people from all walks of life coming up and discussing and agreeing on how best the fight against corruption can be scaled on the continent. Right now also we have what we are calling the Common African Position on Asset Recovery, which is a framework that is trying to have Africa speak with one voice to be able to retain those assets that have been taken away from the continent through corrupt means and all that. So all the African countries, they are supposed to be implementing certain activities, certain things, and speak with one voice. Even as we go to those Western countries where perhaps our millions are stashed as Africans, we need to be able to speak with one voice that these assets need to come back to the African continent, and they can go a long way in building the Africa that we want. An Africa of the Agenda 2063, an Africa of good governance, strong institutions, and whose citizens are actively engaged in the development of the continent, and where corruption has no room in that agenda.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive answer. I really appreciate as well that you talked about youth and youth inclusion, which is something we are very intentional about at You Lead Africa as a program. And even right now, we're carrying this out on the margins of the Youth Lead Summit that we hold annually, bringing together young people from all over the continent. And that probably brings me to my last question. Youth are always eager to know, how can they plug into your processes? How can they be a part of the work that you're doing in fighting corruption? Because obviously it is a primary concern. It is something that comes up every time youth are together and are talking about our continent and our concerns and the things we care about. So perhaps you could share with us a little bit about how can youth plug into your processes? How can they maybe even reach, how can they reach you or reach the AUABC in some way? We always want to just be included, be part of those conversations, because those conversations indeed impact our communities, our livelihoods. So kindly share with us, how can the youth plug in to the work of the board?
Thank you so much for that question. And let me begin by saying, as a board, we are actually very, very open to engagement with the youth. We love it when young people can be able to collaborate with us in as far as fighting corruption is concerned. So there are a number of ways that youth on the continent can be able to engage with us. I think we also have statutory activities such as the African Anti-Corruption Dialogue that I've already talked about. In the recent past, we've been able to invite a few youth-led organizations, some youth that we've been able to work with. So even through that mechanism, we can scale up our intervention with youth. But I also know that young people, they're into tech and all that. We have a Twitter handle that young people can plug into and just connect with us. Every time we have an activity, young people can then come in and share their perspectives using the Twitter handle. We are also on Facebook. Young people can connect with us through that means. But for the more structured activities that we have, I think we can go a step further and make deliberate efforts that perhaps we have a specific engagement with the youths that is exclusive to them. For instance, next year we are celebrating 20 years since the adoption of the convention. We could have a side event with young people, the youth, and just hear their views on how we can scale up our collaboration with them, what other things we can do in as far as fighting corruption is concerned. But also in terms of reviews that we undertake as and when we go to different countries, we also take time to speak to youth. For instance, we go to universities, we have engagements there with the youth in as far as fighting corruption is concerned. But I think there's still a lot that we can do with the youth, and we also welcome ideas from you as young people on how best the board can interact with you. Like I indicated earlier, we are very open and we like it when youth speak to us. Even at the level of the African Union itself, we have the Department of Political Affairs and Peace and Security. They also have different youth programs within the auspices of the African governance architecture. Normally we have a high-level dialogue each year, but before the actual high-level dialogue, there's a pre-youth forum or engagement with the youth, and many young people on the continent have been able to interact with different African Union processes through that scenario. Earlier I talked about the year 2018, where we were running with the theme of the year as African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption. Even in terms of the pre-dialogue activities, we had a youth forum that was dedicated to young people to hear their views on the fight against corruption. And then for the ambassadors that I talked about, the youth ambassadors, we've continued to invite some of them to be able to speak on different aspects in as far as the fight against corruption is concerned, during the dialogue, during African Anti-Corruption Day celebrations and all that. So I think there's a lot that we can do there, a lot of spaces where we can scale up our interaction with the youth.
Thank you so much. I am sure the audience will be very happy to certainly forward some of those suggestions that you've invited. And I encourage you, audience, please let us know what are those suggestions you have. How do you want to be involved? And perhaps we can put that together and submit it to the AUBC with your permission. So thank you for that. And we really appreciate your time once again. We hope to have more engagements in the future in order for the youth to continue to interact with the people at the helm of organizations such as this one, and to, for us not to have a population of youth that's, not plugged in or not informed, or unaware of these different instruments and organizations that are actually working to move us forward. So thank you once again for sharing your time, for sharing from your expertise and your knowledge. We very much appreciate it. And also for your space as well. We are here at the AUABC in Arusha, Tanzania. And we really appreciate it once again. We hope to have you join us, and perhaps you can just give us a parting shot. It could be really anything that you want to share with the young people that join us on this program. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and let me also take this opportunity to thank you for having taken time to come. I think you'll be our ambassador out there. You talk about us and the work that we are doing and how we can collaborate with young people. Now, my parting shot to the young people is integrity or fighting corruption starts with self. So I want to challenge each and every young person on the continent, first and foremost, to have personal integrity. And once you do that, then you have the moral authority to stand on a pedestal and ask others, ask your leadership, take your leadership to account if things are not right. Otherwise, if you are, as a young person, you don't have integrity of your own, then you don't have the moral authority to question others. But I believe that all of us as Africans, the youth inclusive, we have that obligation to start the fight against corruption at a personal level, and then we can go out there and request of the same from others. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much once again. Integrity. If you take nothing else from this conversation, take that important piece of wisdom to choose integrity in your personal life before we even demand the same of our leaders. Thank you once again for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us every single week for the Africa Unplugged podcast, amplifying youth voices in continental governance. Bye-bye.